All right. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is the third webinar in our three-part webinar series on archery. And tonight we're going to be talking about archery hunting for deer. We've got Scott and Jason back, and they're going to introduce themselves as our guest instructors tonight. And so let me just get them off of mute really fast.
Hey, my name is Scott Croom. If I guess we'll introduce ourselves if you hadn't been with us before on one of these webinars. But like I said, my name is Scott Croom. I'm a club member at Fern Creek Sportsman's Club, volunteer hunter and instructor. And so I'm going to talk to you tonight about some different kind of bow hunting ideas and themes.
And I'm Jason Scannell, and pardon me for just a second if I need to hit the pop-up that popped into the middle of the screen. And, I'm a volunteer instructor as well, and hopefully you've seen the other two webinars we've done. The first webinar on archery equipment for hunting, covering the basics of bows and equipment. Then the second one on how to shoot a bow, just going over some of the basics of form and some of the other elements of it. And today we're going on to our third one, and that is essentially how to take that into the woods and how to actually do some of the things that we've shown you for hunting deer. And there could be lots of different reasons people hunt, but if you think about it, archery is a very old sport, and there's evidence dating back 60,000 years for actually bow hunting. And we've come a long way since then, but it's still hard. Bow hunting is one of the hardest types of hunting. And success rates, finding good success rates is really hard to actually do. You can find like elk hunting units and things like that, but average success rates for an entire state really aren't very available. But the best I've been able to come and find is anywhere from 15 to 40%, which is quite a bit lower on average than somebody who's gun hunting. And I want to kind of compare and contrast, just gun and archery hunting a little bit, and kind of show why it's so hard. What's some of the reasons why just bow hunting is hard in general. And the first one is just the effective range of the weapons. You can take somebody with a gun that they don't have a ton of experience with it, and you can get them fairly effective to where they can shoot about 200 yards. And that same person putting in the same amount of time with a bow, actually even more with a bow, let's say we can get them to an effective range of 40 yards. Well, if you look at just the amount of distance that they're covering, if we draw a radius of 40 yards around a bow hunter and then draw a radius of 200 yards around a gun hunter, there's only 4% of the same area for the bow hunter. So the amount of range that we're covering while we're bow hunting is just so much smaller. And so, everything that bow hunters have to do involve making sure that they're getting close. Whether that be how we set up in particular areas, how we pay attention to the senses of the animal. Because deer, they have an amazing nose. And so we have to make sure that we respect that when we hunt. And, they have very good hearing as well. Now, their eyesight's not quite so good, but it's still good enough to where that if we're moving around and, doing things in a tree stand or in a ground blind, they can spot us. And so a lot of the challenge of bow hunting is how do we get that animal to a very close distance, and then not just get it to a close distance, able to execute a shot at that close distance. And so, the big thing in terms of that is, everybody kind of has a little different way of doing it, but a lot of times it's very similar in the same way as how we prepare and how we put ourselves into position to be able to make those shots. And we just want to talk some today about some of the techniques that we use, not so much in terms of exactly where we place a stand or exactly where we place a ground blind, but kind of the process that we use once we have that animal in range. And, some of the steps that we do when we're actually shooting the animal, and then also some of the preparation we do ahead of time. And one of the big things that is involved, and still we're doing a little bit of the comparing, contrasting here. With a gun, we're shooting a very high velocity projectile that is transferring energy into the target. Well, that's almost the exact opposite thing of what's happening when you're bow hunting. It's not moving very quickly. Maybe it's moving, let's say you're really shooting fast and you're shooting 300 feet per second. Well, if you have your bow sighted in at 20 yards and you go out to 60 yards and you shot with that same 20-yard setting, your arrow is going to hit 69 inches lower. And for perspective, I'm 69 inches tall. So, range plays a big factor in it. And the other thing with it is, when I was talking about earlier, how a gun is going to transfer that energy. Ideally, with a bow, we don't want any energy transfer. We want the arrow to go completely through the animal as effortlessly as possible. And a lot of that has to do with the type of broadhead we use. And because we're not actually killing the animal by having, this huge blast into it. Pretty much deer, when we're hunting with a bow, they're going to drip to death, essentially. It's more of kind of popping a balloon as opposed to, really slamming into something. And, from there, what we're going to start doing is kind of talking about broadheads and how, the selections, the choices that you can make, and how it can help you prepare for success. And Scott's going to talk more about broadheads.
Yeah, so Jason was talking about how we've already done a couple of these webinars. The first one being largely equipment based and kind of the gear and things to think about there. One thing we didn't cover in that one was broadheads, and that's a pretty big topic in and of itself. But we kind of left that out sort of for a reason. We kind of did these sort of in, maybe some loose chronological order of like picking your gear, getting it set up, using it, actually, the mechanics of shooting the bow. And now we're kind of into applying that into like a hunting situation. One thing, I don't know if we've actually mentioned it in any of the kind of introductions or whatever. I think I always sort of struggle with the introduction or credentials or whatever, but it might be worth saying that Jason and I spent, upwards of 20 or so years working in an archery pro shop, or, working in and around and helping out in a archery pro shop, which in no way makes us experts or anything, but what it did afford us was the opportunity to work with a lot of different shooters, a lot of different hunters, people of all skill levels, from, very entry level to very advanced. And it sort of painted sort of the picture for us of being able to apply what works for different people and not really getting sort of like locked into one thing or one certain product or type of shooting or just anything. It allowed us to work with a lot of different shooters and be able to kind of see what works for different folks and kind of the pitfalls that people fall into. So with that being said, my buddy Jason was kind enough to kind of let me dive on this grenade of broadheads, which is a pretty passionate topic for a lot of people, but it's something that we need to discuss really. So with that, we'll kind of get into it. One of the things I'm kind of hesitant to do in talking about broadheads is I'm going to try not to generalize, but in some respects, like the conversation we kind of have to kind of lump broadheads into sort of different types. And you should know that when we get into this, that, you've got all different variations of all types of heads, which, range from, really big extreme, heads to really conservative heads through each different type. So just know that there are a lot of variations in each of these three types. But with that being said, we're going to kind of break broadheads into basically three types of heads themselves. The first being what we would call a cut-on contact. Okay, so I'm not sure how well you can see that. So a cut-on contact is going to be kind of what we think of when we think of the standard kind of stereotypical broadhead, where it's basically a blade all the way to the tip, which essentially is the in the name, a cut-on contact. So as soon as that head touches, I've got a knife edge all the way to the tip. It's cutting as soon as it touches. The benefit there, the big benefit there, and here's just another style too. Maybe you can see better if I can get my hand behind it. There's a 4-blade with just a bleeder blade as well. So it's actually not just a 2-blade. But the benefit with that cut-on contact is largely penetration. So I'm not having to poke a hole. I'm not wedging a hole with a chisel tip. It's basically a knife edge all the way to the tip. And generally speaking, I'm going to find the highest penetration with this style head. Oftentimes too, you'll notice that the actual kind of profile of the head itself is a real kind of sleek profile. And what I mean by that is kind of the angle of attack, so to speak, of this blade here. And again, just kind of helping in penetration as far as that goes. So the big benefit to a cut-on contact is penetration. All things being equal, which they're not, but all things, across the board as far as broadheads, you're generally going to find the best penetration out of those. Now the downside, so you say, well, if it penetrates the most, why would I use anything else? Well, and again, I'm generalizing, but generally speaking, your cut-on contacts will oftentimes have the most blade surface or the most exposed blade up front. In other words, the biggest wing, for lack of a better term, on the front of the arrow. So this blade is going to try to catch and steer air, just like my fletchings would be doing on the back of the arrow. This blade on the front is going to try to catch air. And, if this head is not perfectly concentric with the shaft itself, it's going to want to catch air and pull that off target. If I've got a head that's bent or damaged, if I've got an insert or like the end of my arrow might have, cut a little crooked or something like that. And my insert's got just the tiniest little bit of lean to it. If, I make a bad release and I'm excited and I kind of punch the release or torque something on the release. If I'm shooting in a crosswind, if I do everything perfect and the wind's blowing, 10, 15 miles an hour from this side, I've got more blade there exposed to catch that could possibly plane me off target. But again, one thing too, and this is across the board, broadhead technology has come a long, long way in the time that I've been bow hunting, the last 25 years or so. And the improvements have just been dramatic, both in durability, consistency, sharpness out of the box. I mean, we're probably dealing with better heads now than we've really ever had. So, and one thing, before I get too far into the broadheads too, one thing I do want to say in regards to that is whether we're talking about any of the types here, I would say buy the best broadheads you can shoot. I don't care if somebody skimps on a sight, a low end bow, bargain arrows, all that stuff is really not what really matters. What's actually killing that animal for you is the broadhead. Not to say that there aren't some deals out there that you got to spend a ton of money, but a lot of your real bargain basement, if you're finding them at, big bucks, discount store and you're getting a 3-pack for $9, you're probably getting some really low quality materials, both in terms of durability and in how they're going to fly for you. So, again, here we are making, generalized statements, but shooting good broadheads is one thing I would tell somebody to it's generally speaking worth your effort to shoot something of decent quality or good quality. You're just going to find better performance all the way across the board. So anyway, that's kind of our first type there is cut on contact heads. Again, benefits being high penetration, possible downside, maybe a little more planing possibility, but still a lot of good flight out of a lot of these heads. And one maybe downside you might look at too is a lot of these heads, a lot of your cut on contacts are a fixed blade in a sense that you can't change that blade out. Now, my Magnus here, I could change these blades, but my old Bear razor head here, it's basically stamped from the factory. It's kind of a one-shot deal. So if I want to resharpen this, I'm having to hand resharpen this. And I will say that too is whatever style broadhead you shoot as sharper blades as you can. So whether that means replacing the blades with good, fresh, sharp ones, or learning how to sharpen themselves, learning how to sharpen the blades yourself, that's a big deal. You want to be hunting with stuff that's as sharp as you can possibly get, and not be going to the field with dull heads. So that's cut on contact. Our next kind of step in evolution, not really better or worse, just different, is what we call a fixed blade, a replaceable blade. So hopefully you can kind of, let me see where my camera's at here, kind of see that. So what I've got there is not terribly different than that cut on contact, but what I've got here is a head that generally speaking is going to be like a chisel tip. So I'm not quite cutting as soon as it's touching. It's kind of poke and wedge a hole. But with this style head, I've got actually replaceable blades. So I can shoot and practice with this head. And then when time comes, I want to, pop these out. I can pop new ones in and fresh, sharp blades in and not be worried about, resharpening these heads. One thing you'll notice too, kind of side by side with the cut on contact, is how much smaller profile. Both these heads have a very similar cutting diameter, even though they look way different in size. But because of the shorter, steeper nature of a lot of your replaceable blades, I've got less blade surface. And even though I'm going to cut basically the same size hole, same diameter hole, I've got much less blade surface, so much less potential for wind planing. Again, whether that's bow induced, shooter induced, outside conditions of wind, whatever. A lot of your more kind of modern fixed blade replaceable blades are going to have that much smaller blade profile for the same cutting diameter, and generally fly very, very well. And again, I've got the option there of just replacing those blades will actually just pop out, take the head apart and replace them. And that allows me to get fresh, sharp blades in there. So again, benefit there. Most of your fixed blade heads tend to be very, very durable. They're going to shoot real well, fly real well. The only real, I guess, downside of either of those two styles is that you have exposed blade surface, and it's going to maybe magnify some tune issues or form issues. So if you're shooting in the backyard and everything's going good with field points, and you put a broadhead on, that broadhead, again, because it's basically a wing or has the opportunity to plane from the front of the arrow, it's basically going to magnify mistakes. Now, again, that can be any number of things. It could be the tune of the bow. It could be an issue with arrow spine. It could be, quite often it's shooter related and somebody's doing it with their form. But you want to make sure you shoot those heads in advance to check point of impact and make sure things are flying well and flying good and straight for you, to really get the maximum penetration and everything there. Which kind of brings us to our last style of head, which would be a mechanical style head. What I've got here is a head that actually the blades are enclosed in flight. So it's essentially kind of like, think of it like a two-stage sort of system. The head, the blades themselves are enclosed in that ferrule in flight. So I've got a very small profile as far as what's going to plane or what's going to possibly pull that arrow off course. And then when the head hits, you'll notice I've kind of got sort of like some ridges here on the front of that arrow. And when that hits, what's going to happen is hide and hair and tissue and everything is going to catch that leading edge and pop those blades out. And like this is what would be called like a rear deploy mechanical. And that head would go from this position to those blades coming back and being, deployed like that. So the benefit there is With that style head, I basically have very, very little exposed blade surface during flight, and I generally have a really seamless transition from field points to broadheads as far as my point of impact changing. Mechanicals, and again, you want to shoot them to verify, but mechanicals will quite often fly very, very, very similar, if not the same as your field points. Here's a different style mechanical head. This is a little different, kind of older style mechanical, what we might call like an over-the-top style mechanical. So this one, instead of the blades deploying from the front to the back, well, they're still front to back, but they basically kind of go over the top. So I've got an O-ring here on this one that actually holds the blades closed. And again, I've got a leading edge of that blade that when that blade hits, it's going to catch hair and hide and tissue and deploy those blades to the back and be opened. So, you might say, well, okay, if mechanical is, generally your best flying, why not just shoot that for everything? Well, there's some different downsides to a mechanical too. The first and most obvious that most folks like to point out is, reduction in penetration because of the blades deploying. And there is some truth to that. There is, it's definitely going to rob or use some energy from the arrow penetrating to force these blades open. Okay. So that's, you're using some potential energy there in that scenario. The other thing, and here we are back to generalizing again, but the other thing with a lot of your mechanicals, where it's real common for your fixed blades, both cut on contact and replaceable blade, to be 1 inch, 1.125, maybe 1.25 inch cutting diameter. It's really common for a lot of your mechanicals to be 1.5 inch, 1.75 inch, 2 inches, even some heads even above 2 inches. So not only have we used energy from the arrow to deploy the blades and open them, we're also trying to drive a much larger cutting diameter through the animal as well. So there's a big use of energy right there too, trying to push that on through the animal. The other thing is in terms of durability, you can see on most of your fixed blades, I've got a blade that's basically, supported, has some structure on the rear of the blade to help with durability. Same thing with, my cut on contact here. I've got a blade that has structure here on the rear of it that would give it some strength as far as it holding together and not getting bent up or mangled up on its way through ribs or whatever the case is. With most mechanicals, I've got very little, if any, structure on the rear of that blade. That blade's basically just kind of jackknifed over there. So much more prone to being damaged, bent, sometimes even broken off on the way through. So again, generally speaking, a more fragile style head. So just kind of something to think about there. Again, mechanicals will kind of run kind of the gamut as far as how aggressive or how modest. But I would say if you're, a low pounded shooter, say, you're mid 30s, 40 pounds, 45 pounds, probably want to be looking at staying with like a cut on contact style head because of the penetration factor. You're just going to have a head that's going to penetrate better than anything, essentially. You get a little bit above that, you're not going to see a ton of difference in like a chisel tip replaceable blade, but maybe not quite as good penetration. But if you get a little bit above that, that's kind of where the replaceable blades are nice. With most mechanicals, I would tell most people, and this is a really blanket statement that I'm sure could be wrong in a lot of scenarios, but for most mechanicals, you're going to want to see somebody be upper 50s to 60 pounds or well above. And if you're on that lower end at 60 or a little bit below, maybe you probably want to definitely be staying with the really modest style mechanicals that are, say, 1.25 inch, 1.5 inch at the most. This is a lot of blade to be trying to shove through a deer. But so you really want to kind of, if you're going to be thinking about mechanicals, definitely be on the upper end of energy range as far as broadheads go. So again, that's not like great detail on any of that stuff, just kind of some things to think about and some different style heads. There's all different brands, manufacturers, qualities, types. You got to sort out what works for best for you. But hopefully by now, if you're kind of doing this in series, you've got your gear, you've been shooting at some, you're hitting what you're aiming at, and you may have an idea of where you're at poundage and energy wise, and might make a little bit of a kind of an informed decision as far as that goes on broadheads. I think that's probably all I got on broadheads. I'm sure maybe we'll get some questions on that hopefully later. We kind of fill in the gaps on anything we didn't talk about, but I think Jason's ready for you now, and we'll kind of get to actually talking about like leading up to the shot and some things to think about there.
Yeah. What I kind of want to shift the focus to a little bit is a little bit of, kind of preparation that you do even before you hunt, and then things that, as Scott was saying, leading up to the shot. So let's kind of look a little bit at first, just touch on a little bit of setup. And what I want to talk specifically about is, setting yourself up for kind of success and making things easy for you. So let's say you're like me, you're a right-handed shooter, okay? And I'm, set up in a tree stand, and I have my deer trail coming on this side here. And that's where most likely my deer are going to show up. In order to shoot, I would have to completely move myself around the opposite direction. And that's something we don't want to have to do. It's much better if I'm set up to where that my deer trail is here and I can draw the bow like this. And it would be reversed, obviously, if I was a left-handed shooter. But essentially, pay heed to which way that you're going to have the easiest time shooting. Usually you don't want to have to completely reverse yourself around in order to shoot in a direction. And this applies to a ground blind as well, just the way that it's set up. I'm not saying, sometimes there's only one place to set up, and you just have to kind of deal with what's, the situation that's presented to you. But if you have the choice, try to set up to make it easy on yourself. And where I'm saying about that is just in terms of motion in general, whether that be, drawing your bow, getting your feet correct. There's a few things that you can, practice at home that can help you. For instance, when you draw your bow, and if you've been around people shooting bows, at some point you've seen somebody do the deal where they're drawn like this. And, they have just a lot of things going on in order to get that bow drawn back. Well, if you can just draw like this, that's a lot less motion, and it's a lot less likely to be seen by a deer. And just get in the habit of drawing in a way that there's as little movement as possible. Get yourself kind of aimed in the direction of it and draw straight back, as opposed to that big motion, because it gets even worse when you're physically holding a bow, because now you're not just moving your arms and everything, you're also moving a bow around. Just try to do practice in a manner that you don't have a lot of motion. And that can even involve, if you plan on hunting out of a tree stand, you don't have to, if you have it at your house and it lays flat on the ground, you can just get used to standing on it. Just something to get you used to the size of a tree stand. Or you can hang it in a tree in your yard and you might only be a foot off the ground. But it's getting you used to, the situation that is presenting itself. You don't want to have your first experience, if you're planning on hunting in a tree stand, your first hunting experience with a tree stand shouldn't be when you go hunting. Get used to being in a tree stand and knowing what your kind of your limitations in it, and get comfortable as you can with it. Couple other accessories They're not needed. You can pretty much just bow hunt with yourself, bow and arrows. But there's some things that, help out a lot. I personally like to use binoculars, just standard. These are 10 power binoculars. 8 power are probably more popular around here. I'm kind of towards the high end on power in this area. You can have range finders, just a basic range finder that helps to aid in ranging. And all of those are just tools that can help you. Your binoculars, is something that this little movement that I see 150 yards off, is that something important or not? I can slowly take my binoculars up there and look at it and say, oh, well, there's a chipmunk over there, instead of, or, just anything that can help you identify that stuff. Like I said, not absolutely needed, but they're nice. And range finders, like I was talking about earlier, how important range is. Arrows, they don't travel that fast compared to, say, something like a bullet or something like that. And knowing that affect your actual range is really important. If you're off by 10 or 12 yards, you very well could completely miss. And, once you get out to even further yardage, just being off by 5 or 6 yards might make you completely miss the animal. And, there's a couple things to think about, even when you're using a rangefinder, though. A lot of rangefinders, they have this fancy angle compensation, so that when you look down or look up, it tells you an actual distance. Well, a lot of basic rangefinders only have one distance, and that is what we call the true distance. It is the distance from you to what you're ranging. The angle compensating rangefinders are telling you what is essentially the horizontal distance. And so let me pull this a little closer so that you can see it. Please don't judge me on my drawing. But this right here is the hunter. This right here is a cross between an elk, a deer, and a jackalope. And if we range this right here, let's say that's 35 yards. And then if we actually shoot that at 35 yards, we're probably going to end up in a situation where we're shooting high. And the reason why is we need to know our horizontal range. And this only applies if you have a rangefinder that only tells you 1 yardage, not for an angle compensating rangefinder. So what we can do is, if we range this tree that is right there at it, and we now find out that the horizontal range is 28 yards. In this situation, this is the yardage we would want to shoot this at. And it sounds kind of goofy until you do understand the physics of it and everything. But the horizontal range is what we actually care about when we're shooting uphill and downhill. And just a quick little kind of a real life example of it. I shot a deer, this has been probably 10 years ago, but I was hunting on a hill. And so I wasn't very high in a tree stand. I was maybe 12 feet high. But this hill dropped down and it formed a little bench. And then it dropped down again and formed a little bench. And there was a deer on this second bench. And when I pulled up my rangefinder, it said 37 yards. Well, I was fortunate enough to have one of those fancy angle compensating rangefinders. And I was looking at it going, 8 yards, there's no way this is going to work. But it was at extreme enough of an angle to where that eventually I convinced myself to shoot it at 8 yards, and it hit exactly where it was supposed to. Even though the actual true distance from me to that deer was 38 yards, if we had taken a straight line up and measured over, it was only 8 yards. It only matters a lot when you're really high or as it gets closer to you. The more extreme the angle is, the more it matters to know that horizontal range. Now, a couple other things we want to talk about in terms of pre-shot. And this kind of goes into setting up, but it really goes more into us observing in the field. So, once again, we're set up in our stand or in our blind or whatever we're doing, and the deer trail is over here, and we are getting ready to make a shot. If the deer is coming straight at us, we're not getting serious about shooting that deer when it's coming straight at us. We're waiting, and we're waiting until it gets more into a broadside of us. And so for that pre-shot, while the deer is walking over here, still facing us, we're not setting up here and getting ready because our shot is going to occur over here. We need to prepare for where the shot is going to happen. Get your feet set, even though that deer might be moving this way and it's up here. We don't want to be trying to follow it like this. We want to try to anticipate that shot. Now, it's not always going to work. Sometimes, a lot of times deer will change directions. But we need to try to, I shouldn't say we need to, it helps a lot if you can anticipate where that shot is going to occur and get set up for it. So if our mythical deer that's moving along here, I can't shoot here. So I'm getting set up here, and until it does something that tells me it's not going to end up right here, I'm setting up this way. So if it stops and it doesn't change directions, I'm still set up this way. Now, if it stops, changes directions, I'm going to consider moving to another position. But deer, they're not in a hurry to go anywhere. It's not unusual for them to be walking along a trail and then stop and take a bite of something, look around, continue along moving. Just kind of try to anticipate the shot, and it gets easier as you get more experience. But it's not. It's something that once you see it happen, it makes a lot more sense in terms of how to do it and everything. But I want to kind of go into the actual shot process. And Scott, he's going to talk a lot more about the actual shot process here. And then I'll be back here in a minute on another topic.
Okay, yeah, so that's kind of some thoughts about maybe kind of getting ready and sort of thinking about some things leading up to the shot. Knowing the range is going to be real critical. Again, we've kind of talked about it before, but whatever equipment you're hunting with, even crossbow, trad bow, compound, range is going to be critical. So the difference in a 18-yard deer and a 32-yard deer, it's two very different aiming points, especially depending on what equipment you're shooting. So knowing the range ahead of time is going to be a big deal. And then beyond that, we're kind of thinking about angles too. One thing we maybe didn't discuss or didn't kind of clarify, this is terminology kind of gets thrown around sort of a lot. It's kind of like assume that you know what we're talking about. But when we say broadside deer, what we're talking about, and this is just real elementary stuff. When we say broadside deer, we're talking about a deer that's basically 90 degrees to you. Okay, so like you're looking at the biggest, largest profile of its side, looking straight into the side of it. when we say quartering away, what we're talking about is if the camera is the shooter, I'm talking about a deer that's basically quartering away from it, kind of walking away. I think it's good. I think it's got it. And then so that would be a quartering away shot. And obviously there's variations to this. You know, you can have a very hard quarter, you know, you can have a slight quarter, and then you can have quartering into or quartering to. And that's going to be where the animal would be basically kind of feeding to you or working into you at some various angle there. Okay. The reason that's all critical and the reason that's important, especially for, you know, a bow hunter, an archery hunter, is that's changing kind of the alignment of our anatomy here and actually what we're shooting at. Okay. So here we've got a 3D target that's kind of an anatomy deer that actually does a pretty good job. Get this thing kind of lined up here where you can sort of see it, but it does a pretty good job of showing a lot of the things that are going on inside the deer we're actually shooting at. So we're going to basically talk about this with the premise here at first that we're talking about a broadside deer, and then we'll sort of talk about the variations beyond that. But just to kind of, so everybody's on the same page, we're talking about a broadside deer here, okay? The kind of pink thing you see here, the kind of pink looking triangle thing, those are basically lungs, okay? So my lungs are going to sit in kind of a rough triangle shape, sort of flat across the bottom. They're going to kind of come up a little bit of an angle here towards the back and then kind of taper towards the front as they go towards the front. Obviously, got two of them, right lung and a left lung. A double lung, and the other thing too is we're basically going to assume that double lung shot is by far our highest percentage shot for a quick, ethical, fast kill with archery equipment. Okay, putting an arrow through both those lungs is a very, very, very effective shot that with the right equipment is going to put the animal down surprisingly fast. So, and it's generally speaking the largest target of anything too, much bigger than the heart. It's just the largest, most vital organs we could hope to aim at. Okay, with a broadside deer, they're basically stacked side by side. So I've got the highest percentage of hitting both those lungs with a broadside shot. Okay, so our lungs are kind of our target here, and you'll notice the center of them in a lot of scenarios, again with a broadside deer, basically lines up with like the back edge of that front leg. And obviously there's variations to that. Deer are generally walking, so those legs are changing. But just know that like in this static form we're looking at here, it would be, you know, largely centered kind of up the back of that front leg. Okay, so I've got lungs. I got a heart in there too, but the heart sits pretty low. You know, generally speaking, especially from an elevated position, if I'm in my hunting and my shooting, if I'm getting heart, in a lot of cases, it maybe isn't quite intentional. I might be kind of flirting with it just a little bit lower where I want it to be. But you'll have a lot of variation there depending on height of the tree stand, angle of the animal, things like that. But it's right in there too. You can't really see on this anatomy deer, but the lungs sort of sit in kind of a concave manner on the back edge of them. The liver will sort of sit on just the backside of the diaphragm, the muscle tissue that separates the heart and lungs from the liver and stomach and intestines and everything. So you can't really see it here, but there is a pretty large organ there called the liver, which will be a fatal shot, not nearly as fast as lungs. And then behind that, we've got stomach, intestines, guts, things of that nature, you know, from there on back. One thing that's important to mention too is, you know, if you're not familiar with this, if you haven't, you know, butchered a deer or broken down a deer or whatever, but basically this cutaway, what it's showing us here is basically where the spine would be. So these bones here would be like a spinal process that would come up off the top of the spinal column. And then these bones here, which stop for purposes of showing us what we're looking at, would be the ribs that would come down and protect all this stuff. Okay. So my spine actually lays not at the top of the back. So, you know, depending on the size of the deer, depending on what time of year it is and how thick the deer's coat is for that time of year, you know, deer in the wintertime are going to have a lot longer, thicker coat, but that spine is going to be down several inches from the top of the back. Okay. So the only thing I've got at the spine and above is basically this back strap and just meat essentially. So, you know, when I'm thinking about what's a vital shot here, I'm basically not looking from top to bottom. I'm kind of Xing out, you know, on a large deer, maybe 3 or 4 inches at the top and coming down from that, you know, before the lungs actually start. The other thing too, like I say, if you think about kind of a rough triangle as far as how these lungs lay, so that spine will go forward. And as it gets up here into these front shoulders, it's actually going to dip down and go sort of into the center of the neck and kind of taper on down so that, you know, I don't have this like perfect square here that I'm aiming at. The spine definitely does dip down the further I go forward too. One last consideration to think of too, and this target, like I say, does a pretty good job. But what we're dealing with as far as bone structure here, like I say, you got ribs covering the vitals, which even on a large size deer, for most modern equipment, is not that big a thing to deal with a rib. What you do have front are two big bones here in the front. You hear people talk about, you know, shoulder shots and shots that are too far forward, not getting penetration. What we're dealing with is a scapula and a humerus. And so this is like the structure of our front leg, and you can kind of see that right here. So shoulder and that humerus lays, if I get my hand out of the way, lays right there. Okay. So scapula is just like what you got on your back, but what they call the paddle bone or whatever, pretty thin, but, you know, keep in mind too, that's essentially the structure of the front leg. That's all going to be encased in muscle. And then that lower leg bone coming off the shoulder, much heavier bone, you know, that, I mean, I don't know if you can really see a size reference or whatever, but that knuckle and ball joint there really isn't a heck of a lot smaller than, you know, a normal size fist, especially when you factor in all the cartilage and meat and everything otherwise that would be on there too. So you want to think about that, you know, kind of in your aiming processes. You've got some fairly heavy bone structure there that's going to be kind of on the leading edge of that lung. Like say in this scenario here, I would say they probably got this shoulder drawn a tad bit forward or where it would normally be, probably be more similar to kind of being here and blocking some of that stuff. But again, that stuff's all fluid and all moving too. So that's things to kind of consider on your angles. So just some things to think about there as far as anatomy, but like I say, 99.9% of the time, I mean, really all the time, I'm looking at those lungs as being my highest opportunity for a fast, lethal shot. Okay. So how do we take that? You know, we talk about anatomy and what we're actually trying to hit. So how do we take that and apply that in a hunting situation? And like, what are we aiming at? So, you know, we kind of talked about how the backstrap of the spine is not necessarily at the top of the animal. The other thing too is, you know, I've got a reactive target here. Okay. It's not just shooting at a bullseye, something that's, you know, not moving and giving me all the time in the world. Even a relaxed deer can move very quickly at the sound of the shot. So what that deer is going to do is what's called jumping the string, which is not really jumping. It's what's actually doing is reacting to the noise of the bow going off. So it's going to drop down to load its legs up to take off and then push off and push away, generally away from that sound. And doing that, and I'm sure you can see, you know, slow motion YouTube video of this, but in doing that, that deer is going to drop. Okay. So what I'm getting at there is if you're just looking at a real kind of basic picture of like top of the back, bottom of the belly, shoot in the middle, well, you're already on the high side of things because keep in mind, you got this, you know, backstrap and spine, you know, system here that's not at the very top of the deer. Factor that with the animal dropping as well, and you know you're setting yourself up for some, you know, for some high impact. So what I would say is when I'm aiming at this deer, even from an elevated position, I'm going to be basically at the halfway point or slightly below halfway point, maybe, you know, a third of the way up from the belly to halfway, depending on how steep of an angle I'm shooting at there. So just something to kind of think of there. The key there is you want to pick a spot, and this is something, whether it's an experienced bow hunter or somebody that's new to it, it's really easy to get up there and you're excited and your adrenaline's pumping. And I mean, this is why we do this. I mean, this is a big part of why, you know, a lot of people do it, is the experience. And it's easy to get jacked up and kind of have this stress in your mind of like, oh man, this is going to happen. I've got this deer here at 15 yards. Here it's getting ready to go down. And you get to full draw and you put your pins on the deer, and the pins on the deer, and the deer is what you're aiming at. And you just dump the trigger and you shoot, and you didn't really go through your shot process. You're going to want to make sure that you kind of get a hold of yourself a little bit and take time to actually pick a spot out and not just be aiming at a deer, but be aiming at the tuft of hair you want to hit. Be aiming at a physical spot on this deer that you want to hit, and just let that be something to help you kind of slow yourself down and actually go through that shot process. Hopefully by this point, you've already practiced this shot sequence, you know, hundreds or thousands of times in your backyard, and it's just fluid to you, and it's just something you can, you know, go through without even thinking about it. At this point, it's just executing it on a deer. It's just making yourself go through all those steps, going through the process that you know how to do, and just, you know, executing it at this point. So we'll talk a little bit about angles too. So when I'm talking about, broadside deer, everything's pretty straightforward right there. Well, keep in mind, most of us are hunting from a tree stand in an elevated position. Okay. So what's that mean? Well, what that might mean is that maybe I do come in a little bit higher into these vitals, and it brings the arrow out lower on the offside leg. And like I said, there's all variations of this based on how high your tree stand is. Are you in hilly terrain like what Jason was talking about? A key point that I'll talk about there is not so much thinking about, or I guess what would give a little context to this is what I'm thinking of most times is I'm thinking of my exit hole. Where's the arrow going to come out? Okay. So what kind of helps me find my entry point is, let's say I've got a somewhat steep angle on a deer that's quartering away a little bit. Okay. Well, I might aim, back here at the back edge. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but I might aim back here at the back edge of the lungs. But because of my angle, because I'm quartering away and I'm coming in from an elevated position, I'd be driving that arrow out, low in this offside shoulder. And again, what kind of got me to that point, what kind of got me to that aiming point was thinking about my exit and where the arrow is going to come out. So that kind of gives me maybe a little better kind of three-dimensional picture in my mind of actually what I'm aiming at there. So, aiming for the exit hole a lot of times is really what kind of helps me out. So, and that's something too, when we talk about shot selection and kind of picking, what's a high percentage shot and what's a low percentage shot, your effective range is something you're going to have to work out for yourself. I will tell you that in my experience, and I do shoot quite a bit, but 25 yards and in is, with a deer that's giving me a good angle and not super high strung and not alert, that's generally a pretty high percentage shot. As I get further and further beyond that, I'm giving that deer much more time to react to the shot, react to the arrow. I'm giving myself more variance in, where I'm going to hit. But like I say, you have to kind of work out what your effective range is and kind of go from there. One last thing as far as angles too, if I've got somebody that's like a low pounded shooter and not shooting a ton of energy and like penetration is a factor we're really trying to kind of magnify with that shooter, what I'm really going to want to stick to for my high percentage shot selection is going to be broadside shots and quartering away shots. Okay. So, because I'm basically, if I'm hitting where I'm aiming it, I'm only having to deal with ribs and not this front shoulder and the lower leg bone that will be blocking, some of the vitals. Don't get too awful hung up on that. I mean, it's something you should know about, but on a broadside deer, that scapula and shoulder are not blocking 90% of the vitals. Okay. They might be blocking 20% of it, maybe 25% of it, but you generally speaking have more vitals exposed than covered. But what changes there is as that deer, goes broadside and maybe now goes quartering into, well, now I've got a situation where to get that arrow to where it needs to go to, I'm basically having, especially from an elevated position, I'm having to drive through that shoulder blade and drive through some bone and muscle structure there to get to both those lungs. And keep in mind, our whole point there is to be trying to hit both those lungs every time. If I got that quartering into shot and I kind of stick to my same aim point that I had before, where I'm like, right at the back of the leg or right at the crease of that shoulder, that's fine. I might be getting the lung going in, but because of the trajectory and the way it's kind of coming through the animal, I might be coming out, further back in the gut and not getting both lungs and just having a shot that I'm going to deal with, maybe a longer wait time and just more of an issue as far as blood trailing and tracking the animal. So just some thoughts there on kind of angles. And like I said, the main thing for most folks is just have that shot process worked out and really focus on your follow through and really executing your shot there. So that's some thoughts there. I guess from here, Jason's going to kind of talk about, maybe now we've got a shot on a deer and just kind of some like post-shot considerations. The bows just went off and the deer's just taken off. Now, now what are you looking at and what are you thinking about at this point? So,
everybody, first time they shoot a deer is they are excited. They're pumped up, adrenaline and everything. And, there's always a couple things, 3 or 4 things that I always like to try to do whenever I shoot a deer. First one, it sounds incredibly obvious, But I've seen lots of times where people have not done it, and that is watch the deer. You know, it sounds evident, but a lot of times people, they're just so excited that they're trying to, they start, doing other things, and watch the deer and see what it's doing. Is it, taking off running on a dead run? Is it, did it take 2 steps forward and look around and try to figure out what happened and then just slowly walked off? Did it kind of trot a ways and then stop and look around? Just pay attention to what the deer is actually doing, because that gives you valuable information that we can use to help assess the situation. So we've paid attention to the deer. We are at that point, try your best to remember where the deer actually went. It sounds like goofy as can be for me to say, oh yeah, try to remember where the deer went. But I've seen so many different times in the woods where, you go up to somebody and you're like, all right, where'd the deer go? Oh, it went right over there. And you look 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 for sign and you look for sign, and you can't find any sign. And eventually you start kind of looking around and you find sign going the complete opposite direction. And it's just because the person just got so excited and hopped up, that they just, they kind of zoned out and they didn't exactly remember the scenario of what happened. But if you can try to have some type of marker of the last place you saw the deer, and if it ran through past this one particular tree, or it walked past this one particular tree, and while the always try to remember too that eventually once we come down from that tree, our view is going to change a lot. So we're going to want to try to make it something really prominent, something that you can't mistake from the ground, because when especially if you're in a tree stand and you're 15 feet up in the air, when you get down, you might not be able to see the exact same thing as what you saw. And so you want to try to make it, a really prominent thing, like maybe a tree or this shrub that it ran by. We're watching at that time. We're also listening. If after it disappears from view, is it running? Are you hearing, crashing through things? Are you just hearing slowly walking off? Are you hearing nothing? All of those are another factor in the decisions that we're making later on, as far as how we're going to handle that post-shot scenario. A lot of times after I shoot a deer, at that point, I've watched as long as I can, and assuming that it just doesn't fall over to where that I can see it, because that happens, sometimes, where, okay, it's 25 yards away, it's falling over. It's, at that point, it's pretty much a done deal at this. There's not a whole lot more to go into it. But let's just say it goes running off, disappears from view. You hear it crashing or through the growth and undergrowth. It just, you don't have any hearing of it anymore. There's nothing wrong with sitting down and just kind of running over everything in your head. Go through what happened. When kind of replay it back in your head. Where did it feel like the arrow went? Did it feel like it was, right about in the right area, or was it high? or was it low? Was it forward? Was it back? Just kind of set in your mind what you felt like happened. And also try to pay attention to the sound the arrow made. Did it sound like you were plunking the side of a watermelon? Or did it sound like, somebody took a bat and hit a tree with it or something, where it's just a crack or something along those lines? Because all of those all of that is information that we need to use. And we'll talk a lot more specifically about this here in a little while. But just, kind of giving you some examples of things that pay attention to. At that point, if you have binoculars, or even if you don't, try to spot your arrow even from the tree stand or from your ground blind or wherever you're hunting. If you can't find it from up there, or if you saw it run off, sometimes the arrow will stay in the deer. If you see the deer run off with the arrow, it's obviously not going to be right there in front of you. But if you can find the arrow especially on a pass through, that's going to be some very valuable information as well. So, now we're getting down out of a tree. Preferably, I really like to see you calm down a little bit. I don't want to see you, while you're all hopped up on energy and everything, try to, scrambling down, because a lot more bad things can happen if you're in a hurry. You're not going to get in trouble by taking your time and, waiting 15, 30, 45 minutes before you come down. But so we get down, if it's daytime, let's just say, we go over, if we'd spotted our arrow, we try to get to the arrow. If it's nighttime, we're using a flashlight, preferably a nice bright flashlight. It doesn't have to be a spotlight or anything, but just a good quality flashlight that has a nice clean light. So we get over, we find our arrow, and we're looking at our arrow, and we're going to make a lot of judgments based on how that arrow looks. If it's absolutely covered in bright red blood, that means something different than if you pick it up and it's kind of a little bit of a brownish, almost has a little bit of green, and you pick it up and you smell it, and if it smells like a baby diaper, that's a lot different than if it's nice, bright, covered with blood. We're going to treat that in a different way. And then what I kind of want to do here is, just kind of run over some of the scenarios that you might most likely to encounter. We're never going to be able to cover every scenario because number one, me and him, we've not seen every scenario. Sometimes you just run into different things. But like, for instance, Scott, let's just say I shoot a deer and I feel like it was in the right place, just behind the shoulder blade, about mid-height. I kind of hear like a little bit of a thunk sound. I get down, the deer, it took off running really hard. It disappears from view, but I really can't see very far anyway. I can only see 50 yards. I'm in thick woods, and I hear running and running, and all of a sudden I hear a crash, and just where it ends. What would that type of scenario tell you on something?
So something like that, what I would take away from something like that, just that in and of itself is, sounds like a double lung shot. Now, the other things I'd be looking for there is, like Jason said, watching the deer's reaction is a big, big thing to me. You want to see, you want to try to see where you hit, but really when I'm making the shot, I'm trying to really focus on making the shot and not being too concerned with like peeking around and seeing where the arrow's going. So really in my kind of list of things I'm sort of looking at and thinking of, what I think I saw at the hit is really not super high on my list of priority. It's something I consider, but quite often, I'm wrong. Either I didn't see what I thought I saw as far as point of impact, or a lot of times what will happen is, keep in mind this arrow's contacting ribs, bone, maybe that shoulder bone. The arrow can kick and do funny things, especially on quartering shots. So when that arrow's coming in at kind of an angle, so that little flash of color you see right as the arrow's hitting the deer, maybe you see that flash of color 4, 5, 6 inches from where the arrow actually entered and penetrated. So I just say that to say that, what I think I saw as far as the actual point of impact isn't my highest level of concern. What I see the deer do after the fact is much, much higher on my list of things I would consider. The scenario that Jason kind of provided there too, one thing I would expect to see there, if I just pass through, ribs and both lungs, I would expect to pass through it. I expect to be able to find my arrow, and I would exhaust a lot of effort to find the arrow. And that type of hit, what I'd be seeing there on a double lung hit that just passed through ribs, is basically just going to be just straight blood. Maybe there's some bubble in it, maybe not, but just straight blood on the arrow. Sometimes it can be a real, brilliant red and kind of just kind of covered. Sometimes it can be almost a mucusy look to it and almost kind of, pink and kind of clear. But the key there is it's basically just blood. You're not going to have bone fragments. You're not going to have fat and tallow. You're not going to have a big puff of white hair at the shot site in most cases. It's really going to be just kind of straight blood on the arrow. The arrow will really be a big tell factor for you too, because it's going to show signs of what it went through, and that's why it's critical to find it and find the information that it can tell you. Talking about what you see on the arrow, another scenario that you might kind of run into is you make a shot, maybe you don't see the point of impact. You hear the arrow hit, and maybe it kind of makes kind of a plop sound, kind of a more hollow kind of thump. Maybe the deer runs off. If you can see it go a ways, maybe it runs out 60, 80, 100 yards, kind of slows to a trot. Maybe stands there and kind of looks around for a while. Maybe he's kind of hunched up and kind of looking around. Jason talked about binoculars. That's one place where binoculars are a huge benefit. Is in that scenario, maybe I can't get another shot, but I could definitely get those binoculars up and be scoping that animal out. Maybe see point of impact where things are going on, and kind of just have more information to kind of give me an idea of how I want to follow up as far as tracking. In that scenario.
And when we're talking about tracking at this point, we're not looking per se for footprints. We're looking ideally, we're wanting to see drops of blood on the ground or on the leaf litter or on the shrub, next to it. When we're saying tracking, we're not thinking of like the old Indian movies, or not Indian, but the old Westerns where, walking across the bare rock, you can see the footprints or anything. This is us trying to find a wounded or a dying animal. This isn't us seeing footprints in the forest floor. It is just us, trailing on by blood or sign, hair on the ground, lots of different possible things.
Yeah, hair can tell you a lot, and yeah. So what Jason's saying there too is following the blood trail and sticking to the blood trail is a big thing. In this scenario, I was kind of talking about there too, with that deer maybe running out and kind of being hunched up, finding your arrow would be key there too. But that's some signs that would lead me to thinking that there may be shot kind of further back, maybe further back in the guts and intestines, and it's going to require a much longer wait time before I go after that deer. With a double lung deer, again, there's no absolutes in any of this. We're not going to speak in any kind of certainties or anything like that. But a double lung shot is a very, very quick process. And when I say quick, I'm talking 10, 15 seconds. That deer is off its feet and it's not, standing around and kind of thinking about the situation. And it's going to be a very, very quick process as far as how quick that animal's down. With a shot that's further back, still generally going to be a lethal shot, but it can take any variance of time. So you want to proceed with caution as far as that goes. One thing with that one too, again, find the arrow, looking the arrow over very good is going to give you a lot of clues there, and you would be able to smell that stomach matter, and often see it. It'll look like little bits of undigested food on the arrow. That'll give you a big clue there. And one thing too, with what we're saying here, we're kind of talking about that static nature of a broadside deer. Okay, so we're talking about, perfect world scenario of, oh, I passed through just lungs. Oh, I passed through just guts. Oh, I hit, forward. But here, keep in mind that all these shots is going to be probably not that perfect 20-yard broadside shot. You may have a combination of things. So if I did take a shot that was quartering into, and I tuck it in right into the shoulder or just right behind it, and I go through the lungs, maybe the arrow does come out in gut. Often the arrow will show the sign from the last thing it went through. So I might have an arrow that shows gut sign, even though I have a deer that runs out there and expires very, very quickly. So just kind of, that's just something else to kind of think about there too. Jason, what's the scenario if I shoot a deer and, maybe I hear a loud crack, I don't get full penetration, the arrow sticks in the deer and the deer basically loses its footing and falls down immediately? What's going on there?
Yeah, at that point, anytime you hear that big loud crack, you're assuming at that point that you have hit some major bone structure. There's going to be two major possibilities, your front and your back here. Most likely, most of the time, it's going to be a front where, it falls down like that. I'm going to want to see what it does as it falls down. It could be, this area right here where the spine is, you could have gotten into the spine and it could have, at which point it's essentially just on the ground, or you could have busted that shoulder completely and caused it to stumble, and then it can get up and move, possibly. You're going to want to go on the reaction of what's happened at that point. If it goes, kind of limping off, then you're assuming one of these shoulders is busted. If it's not moving, then at that point you've hit the spine, which at that point you'll want to really consider using another arrow, because usually, while it appears to be incredibly effective and it does stop it immediately, that is not an immediately lethal hit. If it's laying on the ground, just not moving, you might want to consider putting another arrow into it into its lungs in a more lethal hit.
Yeah, absolutely. At any point in this, if you've got, even if you think you make a perfectly lethal shot, if you've got after you've taken that initial shot, if you have the opportunity to shoot a second shot, absolutely take it. There's nothing to be lost at that point by shooting another arrow. Kind of scenario there that if you shoot and the deer loses its footing automatically and kind of falls down, you probably hit spine. You've hit high and hit spine. It'd be something you want to be getting a follow-up shot as soon as possible. We talk about these scenarios not like and I don't want to kind of pose this like it's some kind of crapshoot, like, oh, we're gonna shoot this deer and who knows what happens. If you're putting the time and effort in, if you're practicing, if you're doing your due diligence and selecting high percentage shots and everything, you're going to have a very, very high level of success as far as you hitting both those lungs and having lethal shots. It's just something that is worth mentioning, especially to somebody that's kind of new or getting into this. What some scenarios that happen when maybe things don't go right. So, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to kind of pose this conversation like it's, shoot an arrow at a deer and then see what happens. If you're putting your time and effort in and your diligence in, your vital shots into the lungs there are going to be a very, very quick and effective means of taking a deer. So just kind of clarify that too. So
something we want to kind of mention a little bit too is not all the time. You don't always put that perfect shot on deer. Ideally we want to every single time, but sometimes things happen. The animal moves, you get nervous, and of course, I'm always aiming at the right spot, and sometimes things happen, and whether or not we intended to. So let's say we get a little too far back. Instead of getting into this lung area. Now we're starting to get back into here. What's kind of the standard practice that you would do at that point?
So for me, if I've got, what I think is a lethal shot, kind of customary 30 minutes, I would generally wait. Most often, if you're hitting those deer double lung, especially if you got any kind of visibility, you're likely going to see a lot of them fall. You're just going to see the whole thing go down. If I do get a situation where I think I'm back further into the guts or intestines, something like that, you start getting kind of more of a variability of what can happen on the follow-up. I would say in that scenario, you want to wait as long as possible, in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 hours, if at all possible. And the key there is, like I say, you've got a shot that's most likely with a very high percentage going to be lethal on the animal, but it can live for some period of time. If I go in there at 30 minutes or an hour or whatever, I'm very likely going to bump the deer out of its bed, oftentimes without even seeing it, without even knowing I've done it. And oftentimes too on back shots, because of the nature of the intestines and the lack of blood vessels back there and everything, it's often a very, very poor blood trail. So I don't have a whole lot to go off of anyway. And then when I factor in, I've got an animal that can be alive for a while, the chances of me bumping it, my best chances for that deer are to give it plenty of time, give it time to expire, and then go in there and attempt to follow blood, and find it that way. Quite often, if you get a deer that's hit back like that, if you'll slip out, you don't go bumping it. Oftentimes you'll see them, you might even see them bed from your stand. And in scenarios like that, I would try to get out just as quietly and calm as possible and not disturb it. And like I said, just give it plenty of time on follow-up as far as that goes. So,
and something me and him were talking about actually yesterday when we were going over kind of stuff where something that kind of want to emphasize is the conditions that you're facing don't change the shot that you made. So if it's raining, ideally we don't want to be hunting in the rain because that blood trail might be washing away. And even if it starts raining, that doesn't change the shot. So you can't find something that's moving. And so it doesn't matter if it starts raining, you don't suddenly chase it because it started to do something like that. So, always go off of the shot as opposed to what you think you want to do. Don't get in a hurry on this stuff.
Yeah, I think maybe what Jason's saying there, somebody with some experience might kind of put some color on that, but it's for somebody new, it might be kind of hard to put it in context. But we both archery hunt a lot. I have a lot of friends that do. We get the opportunity throughout season to track and follow up on a lot of deer, and it's really easy. You got that excitement. You want to go get it. You got this sense of urgency, and there's always something that's going to make you want to get out there and follow up maybe sooner than maybe you should. If it's a less than perfect shot, I got to work in the morning. Its conditions are hot. I want to get to the deer before it spoils. I want to get to it before coyotes do. Oh, there's rain coming, and I want to get to the deer before rain washes the blood away. Those are all considerations, but they don't change the scenario of what the shot was. So again, that might be a little hard to put context to, but you want to stick to your guns on what you saw after the shot, what the arrow's telling you, what the blood trail's telling you. So,
and I guess we probably ought to kind of be wrapping it up. We're probably going a little longer than what we.
Yeah, I mean, same thing as all this stuff. It's hard to fit it all in. It's a world of little small little tidbit things and considerations to think about, but we just kind of wanted to cover some stuff about the actual shot and the hunting aspect of how to effectively take a deer with archery gear. So
we do have a couple questions in the chat if you want to go ahead with those.
Sure.
All right. So the first one was, what do you think about flint napped arrowheads?
If you want to do things the hardest way possible, go for it. More power to you. That is the hardest way to do it, but if you can do it and you can nap your own arrows and everything like that, more power to you. You got anything?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any big thoughts on it. I mean, I'm no kind of historian or anything, but it's, when we talk about flint knapping and things like that, it in a lot of ways, it maybe has gotten us to where we are today, in terms of effectiveness and just sort of getting the ball rolling the right direction, with somebody with like a modern compound. In most cases, it's not really going to apply. There's probably much better options as far as durability, and flight. But again, I mean, if you look at the timeline, there's been animals been taken with those a whole lot longer than the stuff we're shooting now. So, I wouldn't try to disparage anybody or anything like that. But what we're talking about there is a very high level of doing this. Okay, so we kind of talked early on about the differences in crossbows, compounds, and trad bows, and therein we're talking about like the highest level of commitment in any of this, especially if you're talking about napping your own heads. So yes, they can be done and be done very well. I'm not skilled enough or talented enough to be able to do it. It's just not what I focus my time on. But there are people that enjoy that part of the craft of it, and take animals very effectively. So just know that that's kind of the advanced course in a lot of respects.
The ultra advanced.
Ultra advanced, yes. Yeah.
All right, the next question is, do you think practicing out of an elevated stand helps you shoot a deer in the field?
Yep. 100%.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Just, anything that you can do to simulate the conditions that you're going to face in the field are going to help you. Ideally, if you're going to practice out of a stand at your home or, somewhere, try to match it somewhat to how you're going to hunt. If you plan on, if the tree stand that you hunt is 15 feet high, try to hunt out of a 15 or practice out of a 15-foot high stand at home. Anything like that. I do it all the time. I know you do it.
Yeah, I mean, we keep a stand set up several stands set up in my backyard this time of year that we're practicing out of and everything. And I guess there's a couple facets to that. So one thing is going to be just the act of shooting from an elevated position and seeing where's my arrow impact, what's the sight picture look like from up there, and thinking about the angle as far as how am I getting the arrow into the deer and into the vitals. That's part of it. A big part of that conversation for a lot of years was, well, you shoot so much different from an elevated position. And for a long time, there was a lot of truth to that, but a lot of that was from a lot of older technology bows not fitting shooters correctly. And for a lot of years, we all shot stuff that was sort of one size fits most. And that was fine when I was on this, flat ground and stretch out on the range and doing what I needed to do. But it's real hard to take that stretched out form on a bow that's probably too long for me and shoot that same form down out of a stand. So that's what really complicated things for a lot of times from shooting from an elevated position. Nowadays, with these modern bows, where we've got the fit so much more dialed, and the ability to fit a given shooter so much more precisely, it's not that it's not an issue, but it's not as much of an issue as it used to be. So if you got the opportunity to do it, I would certainly practice it. But in my mind, as much as anything is the mechanics of the shooting, it's almost more just kind of the actual motor skills of like, where are my binos at? Where's my bow holder at? Where do I have a rail on the stand that's going to give me issues? And can I shoot sitting down, or do I have to stand up to actually get over this rail or this limb or whatever the case may be? So a lot of it is just the actual mechanics of like getting the shot off from the stand and kind of where my stuff is laid out.
How much room do I have in the stand?
Sure.
Moving with your feet and stuff.
Yeah, and that even extends to other forms of gear too. When we talk about practicing for hunting, is if you're going to hunt with a face mask on, if you're going to hunt with gloves on, if you're going to hunt with a safety harness on, the more of these things you can
If
run
you're in a
through,
tree, you're going to hunt with safety.
You're going to hunt with a safety harness. So learn to deal with it. If I got this thing cinched up where I can't move and I'm tangled up in it, or if I got it in a way that I've got freedom to move and be able to draw my bow. So all those things are definitely going to shorten the learning curve if you can kind of work those bugs out at home, instead of figuring out that, well, I can't draw my bow this way because my tree tether's got me and I'm locked in here. So yeah, absolutely. That kind of practice at home is huge.
Yeah, even pulling your bow up, just getting used to learning to pull your bow up and lower it down in the stand. And, you mentioned the safety harness. Make sure, even when you're not hunting at home, wear your safety harness.
If you're off the ground, wear a harness. These harnesses have gotten so good now. It's not a hindrance like it used to be. Wear a harness if you're off the ground. I've fallen. Mine's caught me. I don't know about you.
Nope.
I'm clumsy, but that's
I
okay.
wish you hadn't brought it up, but no.
All right, so we have talked a lot about hunting from tree stands with archery equipment, but what about blind hunting? And can you kind of talk about the benefits of one versus the other?
You want to go first?
Yeah, so I largely hunt from tree stands in most situations, but blinds do offer some benefits in some scenarios. Hiding more than one person, if you're going to hunt, with a buddy or a child, that can be a big thing. A lot of great areas, a lot of good, thick, woolly areas with a lot of deer sign don't have suitable trees. So that's, sometimes where a blind can come into play. There's just a lot of scenarios where a blind can work out to your advantage. Some folks don't like heights, and that's fine too. I guess I don't have a whole lot to add to the considerations there. The one thing I would mention, this is one thing I see come up a lot with people from blinds and kind of where things go wrong from blinds is you want to think about, and this goes back to the practice scenario of practicing in your backyard. I'm not sure how well the camera can see this, but I've got a sight line up here where my sight is. Okay. So I'm aiming off my sight up here. Okay. If you'll notice, my arrow is leaving the bow several inches, 3-4 inches, sometimes more, depending on your setup, below that sight. Okay. So what I'm saying is when you're sitting in that blind and you've got this cloth cover that comes up so high and maybe a window above it or shoot through mesh or whatever the case is, you want to be cognizant of where that arrow is leaving. I've seen a whole lot of times where somebody's had a clear line of sight off their sight to the thing they're aiming at, but they're not thinking about where that arrow is leaving, and they'll plug a hole in the side of the blind and have a big crazy deflection or something like that. So you want to, and again, it's just practice. It's just going through the motions of using your gear in the backyard and working the bugs out. But you want to think about, the fact that arrow's leaving lower than what your line of sight is.
A couple other considerations too with the blind. A lot of blinds aren't really made with the bow hunter in mind. They're made more for a gun hunter for turkey season or something. You need to be able to draw your bow back in it. So if you get this little bitty small blind and, especially if you have a long draw length or something like that, and you don't have room to physically draw the bow in, at that point, the blind's kind of worthless to you if it's, a pre-manufactured one. You can also build your own blind. You can, pull some branches in front of you and, just kind of hide behind some branches and stuff. If you have a pre-bought one, a lot of them have blacked out interiors, wear black, dark colors so that, you don't stand out against that black background. The biggest difference with blind hunting versus tree stand hunting is you don't have that higher perspective, so you're not going to be able to see in thicker areas very well. That undergrowth matters a lot more with a blind. You're not seeing over that undergrowth. Now, if you're on the edge of a field, it really doesn't matter that much because there's nothing really in front of you. But one of the good things about blinds is unless you are set up on a hill, you pretty much are taking out, those extreme angles. You're shooting for the most part in a level fashion to the animal. And like Scott said, if you're scared of heights and everything, yeah, absolutely go for the blind. But both of them work.
Yeah, that's some great points. And one last thing too, I want to mention too, like I said, we really focus on, finding the arrow and following up after the shot and using that arrow as a huge clue of what the hit was like and how to assess the hit. With a tree stand shot, most often with a pass through, I'm going to find that arrow driven down in the dirt at some sort of angle, even with a further shot that, maybe is, 25 or 30 yards or something like that, which is not really the norm. Most shots really happen at, 15, 20 yards, something like that. But I'm going to find the arrow driven in the dirt, and it's going to be pretty obvious to me in a lot of scenarios. You got to think with that blind, you're shooting, basically parallel to the ground. and depending on what kind of deflection happens coming out of the animal, you can have a little bit harder situation as far as finding the arrow after the shot. So you really want to, after the shot happens, really take time, sometimes even taking a picture with a cell phone and kind of, memorizing little bitty points of interest or trees or things that look a certain way, just to kind of help you visualize when you get out to help you find that arrow, because it's going to, generally speaking, be harder to recover that arrow as far as using it for information out of a blind than a tree stand.
All right, and then another question just came in. Do you like to hunt with lighted knocks?
Oh. In theory, yes, I do like to hunt with lighted knocks. In practice, I've had the worst luck with lighted knocks. Not when I practice with them, they've worked great, and then when I use them, for some reason, I'm cursed and they don't work. But I'm also really, really, really picky, and there is a difference between the weight of a regular knock and the weight of a lighted knock. And in my mind, it matters to me, even though it probably doesn't matter to me. And he's laughing because he knows I stress out over stuff like this. I've taken all my lighted knocks off my arrows. It's not because I don't think they work. I just haven't had good luck with them. But yeah, if you want to hunt with a lighted knock, go ahead. When they work great. You have anything to add to that? Or
I've played with them and tested them a lot. Same thing Jason's saying. A lot of them work very well. Anything mechanical is not going to work all the time. I don't hunt with them. I'm maybe not as OCD as Jason is, but as the more you get into this stuff, you're going to find, we harp on some early webinars about the word consistency and just being repeatable in your form and in your gear. And in my mind, that's just another kind of level of that consistency. I don't really like switching knocks back and forth between, my factory knocks and a knock that's going to weigh different, possibly have a different profile, possibly fit the string different. In most scenarios that I've experimented with and shot with at 20 yards, they shoot very similar, if not the same, as my factory knocks. But it's still just in my head that it's something different. And again, this might sound a little backwards and maybe sound almost like counterproductive, but when I say I don't put a lot of stock in what I think I saw at the hit, a lighted knock doesn't really change it a lot for me. I know that might sound strange, but again, when you think about that arrow hitting and maybe as it's going in the animal, if it deflects or does something weird, that little last flash of color that I see, maybe it tricks my mind into thinking I had a better shot than what I really did, or vice versa. So I'm really going off other factors that kind of tell me what I hit, and not so much what I think I saw. And a lighted knock for me doesn't really change that a whole lot, especially with close range shots, because it happens so fast. So if I'm shooting a deer at 25 or 30 yards, maybe I do see the impact really well. But if I'm shooting a deer at 12 yards, 15 yards, inside of 20 yards, most often with these modern compounds, it happens so fast. It's just a flash of color. It's just there and gone so quick. So that to me, in my mind, like I say, the benefit for me to a lighted knock is maybe recovering the arrow, helping me recover the arrow if the arrow does come out and maybe hit a rock or come out at a weird angle and kind of skip and not just be driven in the ground. That to me is a huge benefit. But it's not so much as far as telling me my point of impact. I know they've gotten really, really popular with video and hunts and helping show that impact. And it's a great tool for a lot of reasons. And if somebody wants to, invest in them, invest their time, they're a great tool for a lot of people. But if I'm just being frank about it, I don't shoot them. And I don't see it as a big handicap for me, but that's not to say that, you don't shoot them and really enjoy what they do for you. So they're cool, if nothing else.
Something I just kind of thought of that we didn't really touch on. What percentage would you say of deer that you've shot were under 25 yards?
90 to 95%.
And that's pretty close to the same for me. So when we talk about effective range of 40, 50 yards, the large majority of times we're nowhere near that effective range. we're talking, it's much more important to get them in close than it is to learn to shoot further. It just occurred to me that when you mentioned yardage, we hadn't mentioned that, and it's kind of important.
Sure, yeah.
Um,
And that can vary a lot, based on how you hunt and where you hunt. Are you hunting field edges and soybean fields? Are you hunting, in the woods and thick cover? There's a ton of variables there. But for me and my style of hunting and where I hunt, I kind of do a thing where I keep kind of a little journal or kind of some stats in my season or whatever. And most years, my average distance on shots is somewhere around 15 to 17 yards. It's a really close range deal. And some of that's by design to keep my, those high percentage shots up. As you get further and further, like say, you're just introducing variables where things can go wrong. So I like those close range shots.
Okay, so the next question is, what we talked about releases in the last webinar a lot, but what kind of release do you all recommend was one of the questions for this webinar.
I usually recommend a wrist strap release for hunting around here. If somebody wants to use a handheld release, I'm not going to try to talk them out of it. And you could make a strong case for if you are getting really, really picky. There's a reason why most professional archers shoot a handheld release. But in Kentucky, for the most part, we're talking shots under 40 yards. I've just always been really happy with a wrist strap release.
I get that where you can see it a little bit. So what Jason's talking about is just a wrist strap or a wrist caliper. Just kind of a plug and play deal where it's attached to my wrist. I'm actually pulling it, with that strap there. My hand's free to kind of do what it wants. And this one, I don't know if I can turn it where you can see it or not, but basically I'm pulling that trigger to open the jaws, open and close the jaws. Everything's backwards on me.
And some of them have hooks on them instead. And, the exact mechanisms of it don't really matter that much as far as, if it's a hook that hooks onto the loop or if it's a caliper that hooks on the loop. The principle is pretty much the same, as long as it has a good clean trigger on it and everything.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of folks, handheld releases have gotten a lot more popular in the last few years for folks hunting with them and everything. And for in some scenarios for good reason. You can kind of make a case, as far as accuracy. In a lot of scenarios, when you go to a handheld release, you're basically going to like a set style trigger, and it would be the difference in like a stock AR-15 or a stock rifle trigger and a very high end custom trigger. Okay, so is the rifle itself just as accurate with either trigger? Yes, but because of the user interface and that cleaner, more crisp trigger, you can make a case for accuracy. Again, going back to kind of our background and with the archery shop and dealing with a lot of folks getting set for hunting, there's some scenarios where I may trade just a sliver of accuracy for, actual usability in a hunting situation. So, could I shoot with a handheld release and maybe shoot 5% more accurate? Yes, maybe, but I like my wrist strap being tied to me. It's there ready to go all the time. It's very functional and it's just ready to rock. And it's kind of what I've gotten used to and ready to go. That's not to say that somebody can't shoot a handheld release and be just as effective as it with it.
You just have to make sure that every time you grip that handheld release the same.
Yeah.
The wrist strap, it attaches to you. It's the same, once it's attached, it's there.
Yeah.
That handheld release, you have to grip it the same way each time and keep that pressure on it and apply it the same each time in order to see that accuracy benefit. Without
dwelling here too long, I guess just kind of a real quick explanation of so usually a wrist caliper is going to be fired with your index finger. So I'm going to fire that by pulling it with my index finger. Most of your handheld releases, most commonly for hunting, are going to fire by your thumb. Okay, so again, just a real generic explanation. But when I'm talking about dealing with that tip of that index finger, I'm probably talking about like the most sensitive part of my hand. Okay, with that thumb, for me anyway, it's a more kind of dumb part of my hand. and I'm able to kind of wad up more leverage and force there without feeling the trigger as much, and actuate the trigger in maybe a little bit cleaner manner than actually feeling everything with the tip of that finger. So I mean, it's I don't want to get too caught up in the details there, but for some folks it can be a little.
And I do want to mention one thing about Scott's here is if you look at how long that is right there, it looks like it's really short, but we don't have any weight on that. So now when we put weight on that, it's going to stretch out and it's going to be the right length. Almost everybody right out of the gate, when they use one of those wrist straps, they make it way too long. It needs to be at a comfortable place where you can anchor, and it's right there. You know, not to where that you're stretching your finger out like this, but to where that you can hook your finger around it and then squeeze it like that.
That's probably a long-winded answer for you.
That's good.
Okay, while we are looking for the last couple of questions, I found some visual representation of the clues that you guys have been talking about on the arrows. And so if I could pull those up really fast. So the first picture here, folks, that we're looking at is a lung shot, a representation of a lung shot. And so the clues that we're looking for here are really visible on the fletchings of the arrow here. And what you're seeing is that light pink and foamy, or the bubbles that Scott and Jason were mentioning earlier. And that's the indicators that we're looking for our lung shots. The next one here is an arrow that's gone through the heart. And so it has a darker color. This says brighter crimson red color. It's a little bit thicker. You don't really see the bubbles that you saw in the lung shot. And so that's an indication of a heart shot here. And you can even see that with the thicker blood, it's on the shaft of the arrow as well. If we go down a little bit further here, the representation here is for a liver shot. And this is even darker still than the heart shot, thicker, and you can definitely see it on the shaft here. So you can kind of see some chunks of the liver either actually on the fletching of this arrow here too. And then the last one, the one we don't want to see, the stomach or the gut area shot, that's really grainy. It's kind of green, brown color. You can actually see some remnants of whatever this deer was munching on. And it's gonna have an odor, and it's an unmistakable odor. There's no question there. So this resource was put together by the Archery Trade Association in their Explore Bow Hunting Student Handbook. And I just wanted to share that with you, and I can send that along after the webinar as well. So let's get back to Scott and Jason. Also, last call for questions. If you have them, feel free to come off mute if you need to. If you have a scenario you want to discuss, we're open to that, but I'll let Scott and Jason wrap it up here.
Yeah, that's probably most of what we got for you. That's some real good pictures actually to kind of go off of. Those were really a real good kind of close representation of a lot of what you could see there. And like I said, the arrow is going to give you so much of a clue to what you hit. And keep in mind, it's not a two-dimensional thing. Quite often, especially with quartering shots, you likely got more than one organ. So if you had a quartering away shot, maybe it started in gut, but maybe it kind of come out forward, and just kind of try to put the pieces of the puzzle together in your mind and with the clues you've got to work with too. One last thing I would say too, and not to delve too much into it, but about the only thing that we didn't talk about, Becky had a great example there of like liver blood being a much darker color. And it's a great kind of tell or clue there. Another thing that you'll find too is if you're seeing a lot of like fatty tissue, like a tallowy, kind of greasy, almost like you shot an arrow through a pack of bacon or something. That's generally not going to be a good center of the ribs, center of the vitals hit. That's generally going to be like brisket, kind of low belly, something like that. And same thing with like meat. If you're finding like meat, chunks of meat on the arrow. That's generally very seldom from like a good, rib double lung hit. You're just not often going to see a lot of that kind of, beef jerky kind of looking meat on the arrow. It's going to be 99% blood in most cases. And again, there's a lot of variability there, but that's kind of two other scenarios where if you're seeing those two things, may not be the best scenario as far as following up. So just kind of take that with what you see.
And sometimes you can, we were talking about the bright blood versus the dark blood and stuff. Sometimes you can have really bright blood and it just completely end, and it be from a muscle hit where it's clotted and it's stopped. You can go off the color of blood, but it's not the end all be all necessarily on that.
Yeah,
stuff.
that's a great quick point too. If I'm following a blood trail, especially with a double lung hit, I can expect to see blood out, both sides of the trail. If I'm seeing what looks like kind of, spray and blow where I've got maybe some kind of carry to the blood, I'm thinking that's going to be, heart or lung related where I've got some kind of pressure pushing that out. If I'm seeing, more kind of drips kind of straight in the track of the deer, where blood's just kind of falling off the side of the deer, not getting kind of thrown or blown off the side, that might, lead me to believe it's a little more of a muscle type hit. So again, it's all sort of different scenarios, and nothing is the end all be all as far as a clue, but it's all just pieces of the puzzle to put together.
We did have another question come in. Have either of you ever lost a deer that you hit?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I can say from my experience as a hunter as well. Me too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So two, and I don't want to keep you guys all night, but if you're willing to talk, we'll talk. But two kind of main scenarios there for me, and I don't want to speak for Jason or anybody else, but two kind of main scenarios there. So losing a deer, what happened? Okay. When Jason was talking about the actual impact of the arrow and what damage is happening, what's going on there. Again, I don't have that splash and that kind of shock effect of a bullet where I'm really affecting tissue way far away from the point of impact. I'm only affecting the tissue that the broadhead is touching, generally speaking. So largely, when I didn't recover a deer, it was either my improper follow-up. So in other words, let's say I hit a deer back and I had a gut shot and it's going to be a lethal shot. It's just going to take time. I either went in too soon or I went in, and didn't have blood to follow off of, and just kind of a poor scenario there. And that scenario, as far as a gut shot goes, giving the deer plenty of time, giving the deer 12 hours, giving it overnight, giving it as long as you can, and then going there, attempting the blood trail. But if you're not following that blood trail, kind of moving in the direction of travel and maybe at that point grid searching. If you can employ a dog, there's a lot of access to tracking dogs nowadays. That's really kind of become a big thing in the last few years. That's a great tactic too on a situation like that with a gut shot deer. So that's something to kind of consider too. But so poor follow-up on my part was a big reason I've lost a few deer. And then the other thing is just not hitting lethal spots on the deer. So I can do everything right, and maybe I make a bad shot. Maybe the deer moves. Maybe I had a deflection. I hit the arrow hit a limb on the way there, and the arrow impacted 6 inches higher than I wanted to, and I hit the deer across the top of the back or something like that. If I've got a scenario that it's not a lethal hit, which does happen, obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but you're not going to find that deer, and you should absolutely exercise, all your due diligence and put your effort in to make every effort possible. But just know that, it's, it kind of becomes a default answer for a lot of folks to think, well, I shot a deer and I've got blood, I got to go find the deer. There can be scenarios where if you hit a deer, like I say, across the top of, I took a deer last year, actually, in Indiana, that had a wound across the top of his back. He had been shot by something within the previous couple of weeks, and he was fine. He was running around chasing does, and it wasn't much more than a scrape for him. But I'm sure in that hunter's mind, he saw, an arrow impact a deer, and a deer was bleeding, and he was following it, and maybe possibly didn't understand why he didn't find it. Well, again, it's simple, but if the deer's not dead, you're not going to find it. So you can have a scenario that, deer may bleed, but it's not going to expire. So just
and a lot of muscle hits aren't particularly lethal. If you think about bucks, especially in rutting and everything, they're constantly stabbing each other with their antlers, and they can survive a lot. Things that we would think would be just absolutely unsurvivable, they can keep on going, and you can feel like you've seen a lot of blood on the ground. It has to be out of blood, and in reality it might have lost an ounce of blood or even less than that. If you put this amount of blood in an eyedropper, you can make a pretty dang good blood trail for somebody to follow a long ways. So what we think is a huge amount of blood on the ground might not really be a huge amount of blood.
No, that's a great point. It's we talked about blood trailing and kind of clues to follow up on, and really and this might be kind of hard to picture, but the amount of blood doesn't necessarily that's not necessarily like a lethality gauge as far as the more blood, the more lethal the shot. I can think of several scenarios, even last year, tracking deer that had a deer that might have bled a long way. Don't find a deer, don't recover a deer, and then 2 weeks later get a deer back on camera that the hunter had taken had a high shoulder shot and just didn't hit a lethal part of the deer, basically hit muscle, and the deer recovered just fine.
This area right here is famous for that. Right up here, real high on the back.
And the key there is just just learn what those high percentage shots are for you. Learn what your effective range is. Be diligent and stick to it, and just really try to focus on those high percentage shots, and you'll really see your percentage go way up. I feel like we talked a lot about like losing deer and when things go wrong, and it can happen. It's something to talk about, but if you'll stick to those close range shots and knowing what your limitations are, you're going to enjoy a very high level of success.
Mm-hmm.
One of the participants shared a scenario, which kind of brings up another topic. What about arrows that don't pass through, but they stay in the deer? How's that affect your blood trail?
So ideally, we want to pass through because that's 2 wounds. So if it stays in the deer, there's a big difference between this much arrow sticking out of the deer and this much arrow sticking out of the deer. Even though in this case, even though it didn't stay, it stayed in the deer, it probably came through the other side. So a lot of times what will happen is, it'll get broken off. So you'll find a piece of your arrow. And if this much of your arrows laying on the ground, you didn't get hardly any penetration. And so it's probably, still track, do your diligence, but you probably didn't hit anything real important at that point. Versus if this much of your arrow is broken off, then it's a different scenario. You got a lot of arrow in that. Now, a lot of times that arrow is plugging the hole on both sides or on one side, and so it's not going to bleed quite as much. You're gonna have a harder time tracking that, but it just varies depending on if you know how long your arrow is and you take that piece of deer, just do the math and say, okay, I'm through the other side of the deer when it's this half, so most likely it went all the way through. It just didn't go, it just stayed in the deer. And some, there's the rare occasion where you'll find this piece of arrow, this piece of arrow. But it's just, you just have to read the signs that you're seeing. Are you seeing blood? Is it something clear that you're seeing instead that kind of, looks like blood, but not really, just what, you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if at all possible, pass through is definitely your more optimum scenario. Again, you got the arrow to go off of, you've got an exit hole in the deer, you got in theory from a tree stand, you've got a lower exit hole, which is more apt to drop blood, to give you the ability to track. Also, too, I've noticed a lot that if I do leave an arrow in a deer, I generally get a kind of a bigger reaction, kind of more of a flight reaction out of the deer versus just passing one through it. A lot of times I'll have a scenario where the deer maybe kind of jumps, take a couple of bounds, maybe even goes back to feeding or kind of trots off a little bit. But you get kind of more of that kind of panic flight when I leave an arrow in a deer. We talk about generalizing and no two scenarios are alike, but here's kind of two scenarios you'll find with leaving arrows in deer. One of them is going to be the arrow impacts, and I get very little penetration. You know, notice the arrow's really kind of doing a lot of wiggling, and you've seen a lot of arrow maybe as the deer runs off. What'll happen a lot of times in that scenario is you've hit this front leg bone or maybe the shoulder, and what'll happen a lot of times is you may see the deer run. I'm kind of backwards here because I'm on the wrong side for the shoulder bone, but you'll see the deer run some distance, and that arrow looks like it gets sheared off, almost like like a big paper cutter or something. Just took it right off. And when you find that arrow, what you'll often find is a lot of heavy damage right up here at the tip end of it. Maybe even the insert still in it or whatever, but you find very little penetration. That's a scenario where you probably hit the shoulder or the leg on the side you're looking at. The other scenario with not getting a pass through, and again, these are just two kind of common scenarios, would be, especially if I have like a quarter and away shot. So maybe I'm driving kind of from the rear going forward, and maybe I impact in the offside shoulder. So I've basically traversed through the rib cage, traversed through all the vitals, and it stopped in the far shoulder. And maybe I break that arrow off, maybe I don't. But in that scenario, the arrow will generally be broke off further on back, and a lot of times it may
like down here.
Yeah, I'm hitting
this leg bone.
I'm hitting the same
Coming
bone,
through
but on
this
the
one.
opposite side that I've come in, like I say, kind of come in from the rear at somewhat of a quarter and away angle, and that far leg bone has stopped me there. It's just something to kind of consider. But again, I'd still be looking, if I started blood trailing, I'd still be looking for that arrow pretty hard along that blood trail if I can find pieces of it to just kind of give me a clue to what I'm following up on. So,
and sometimes that arrow will actually pop out, and in which case, a lot of times it's like a spigot at that point.
yeah, I've had that happen too, where you find the arrow actually fully intact, just like along the blood trail, especially with mechanicals where they'll reverse and fall out.
Mhm.
But you'll find that on the path.
That's one thing you'll see a lot of times, especially with your bigger cutting diameter mechanicals, is you won't see those full pass throughs because there's just, it's just such a big blade that you're trying to pass through there that you just can't make it. Big mechanicals are kind of famous for that, not getting a full pass through.
Yeah, getting a pass through would definitely be a large goal that is definitely going to benefit you in a lot of ways for sure.
All right, well, that was our last question. Anything else you guys want to say?
I hope not. I think that's all we can talk about tonight.
Yeah, just thanks for taking the time to watch and everything and having us.
Yeah, if you stuck around this long, we really appreciate it. Hopefully some little bit or tidbit or something we've given you has maybe helped you out and maybe kind of helped you think about something a certain way. So it's a lot of information. Good luck, and season will be here before you know it. Practice with your gear and be ready. It'll be here before you know it.
All right. Thank you guys so much for another great webinar, just packed full of awesome information. That does conclude our archery webinar series. If you missed the first two webinars, they are recorded and on the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. So that's where this one will be as soon as we're done here. You can watch them all again. Let me know if you have any questions. You guys have my email. And with that, I just want to say I didn't introduce myself in the beginning. So if you've not met me, I am Becky Wallen. I'm the Field to Fork Coordinator for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Like I said, reach out with any questions you have. If you are watching this on YouTube, thank you. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so that you get notifications when Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife has more resources up on the channel. With that, well, thank you again, and y'all have a great night.